So my name is Josie Ensor. I'm the British Telegraph newspaper's US correspondent and former Middle East correspondent based in Beirut. And I'm introducing and moderating a panel on the dynamics of security and development in Africa. With me, I have Dr. Peter Neumann, the Professor of Security Studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. With him, we have Professor Karima Bennoune, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights and the visiting professor at the University of Michigan's Law School. Lastly, but not leastly, we have Dr. Ojewale, ENACT's Regional Organised Crime Observatory Coordinator at the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you so much for joining me all. So the first question I'd like to ask you all, the concentration for the last few years at least has been on ISIS and its caliphate in Syria and Iraq. Do you think we're going to see, have we seen in the last year, and will we continue to see a shift in ISIS's concentration from the Middle East to Africa?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll start. And I do think we've seen some of that, even though it's probably wrong to say that every conflict that's happening on the African continent is related to that. We know, of course, that conflicts like in Somalia or in West Africa have been going on for a very, very long time. But we've also seen some of the individuals that were active in the Syrian conflict relocating to parts of Africa and probably contributing to making these conflicts worse or providing a different dynamic to them. So yes, we've seen that to some extent, and it's something that should be of concern.
And I know you've looked into this, Dr. Neumann, but have we seen any evidence of those who've travelled to join ISIS in Syria and Iraq now joining conflicts in countries like Libya or indeed sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, the proliferation of ISIS to Libya kind of started precisely like that, long before we started talking about escalating conflicts in Africa. It was started by Syrian fighters from Libya coming back to Libya and setting up shop in Libya. But we've also seen that to a smaller extent in other theaters of conflict. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because of course we know that some of these conflicts are regionally contained, but when they connect to the wider narrative of ISIS, the struggle for a so-called caliphate, they take on a different dimension, they take on different dynamics. We've seen that in Africa, but also in other parts of the world.
Can I jump in on your initial question about whether this is a shift? I think it would be more accurate to characterize it as a spread or an acceleration in other regions, because my fear is that using the rhetoric of shift suggests that the response should literally geographically move or shift in focus. And I think what we've seen is that the approach has to be a global one, because otherwise the problem will simply move elsewhere. And one thing that really strikes me is the lack of appropriate international response when we see mass casualty jihadist attacks on the African continent. I'm very sorry that both this violence and these victims receive much less attention internationally. And I think this is both morally objectionable and a very large strategic mistake. So when we see sort of scores of casualties in Mozambique, as we did in the spring, there needs to be a thorough recounting of the stories of the victims and equal global determination to respond in a thoughtful way, whether it's in Africa or any other region.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, from my reading, the number of attacks that ISIS claimed credit for in Africa grew by a third from 2019 to 2020. Do you think, I mean, as you said, does everyone agree that the coverage is kind of outsized coverage that ISIS got in the Middle East, and maybe it's a mixture of coronavirus too, but do we think that it's a problem that there doesn't seem to be any kind of media coverage of these sorts of events?
Okay, let me quickly also intervene on this. I think what is important from what the earlier speakers have said is the fact that what is happening in West Africa, for instance, now, you remember about 6 or 7 years ago, when JAS, the popular Boko Haram, was factionalized, then one pledged allegiance to ISIS as the province, West African province annex of ISIS. And then you have a situation whereby what has gained a foothold, particularly in the East, is now percolating in African countries. And by extension of what we have seen in Libya, I can tell you authoritatively from available evidence in terms of the work that we are doing and what we have come across in terms of field work, that particularly what is seen playing out in the northwestern part of Nigeria now, and by extension, a fringe into maybe Niger Republic, Burkina Faso, is a situation whereby the emboldened jihadist group have suddenly found a lucrative spot to carry out all form of criminal activities. And what is playing out is what has been largely regarded in policy and academic environment as crime terror nexus. So they've suddenly find a soft spot to carry out their activities. Recruitment is going on a daily basis because of the multiple crises, because these spots have been multiple spots of all kinds of violence, like Peter Neumann said, over the years. And then you find a situation whereby, due to poor governance mechanism, lack of international cooperation and support, because what is playing out is of international dimension, and a single country cannot contain it. So you find a situation whereby the jihadist group are not just pledging allegiance to more sophisticated group in the Middle East, but they are also recruiting locally, internally, because of the failure of governance that has pervaded the entire environment over the years, what is popularly referred to as ungoverned spaces. And then whatever you call it, whether it's counter-terrorism or country-violent extremism, has largely been military-centric, kinetic operation, without paying attention to other areas that is going to help in maybe addressing this crisis. So you have a situation whereby the whole place is blown up. And I'm going to anchor on this as someone that has been working within the continent of Africa. We should be concerned. Government should be concerned. Policymakers should be concerned. CSOs should be concerned. Non-profit organizations should be concerned. The think tank that have intellectual responsibility to unearth these things and suggest policy recommendations should also be concerned. Why? Because the sophistication in terms of military response that you have seen in terms of particularly foreign investment in military operations that you saw in Afghanistan, that you have seen in Afghanistan and all these places, is not available in this region, the Sahel and Greater West Africa. And then coupled with the weak governance mechanism in responding to this, surely the displaced jihadist group members are surely finding a footing in West Africa and Greater Sahel. And I think government is not doing enough. And those are the areas that we need to begin to suggest solutions, moving away from this whole kinetic approach alone, which is military-centric, which we just saw the failure of it in Afghanistan now. It's important that we now concentrate on issues that have been driving violent extremism, terrorism, the fundamentals that are providing the enabling environment for this thing to fester. There's a need for that international support that Professor Karima just mentioned about. It is very, very important. Thank you.
I'd just like to pick up on that, because I know I've looked at your research into Nigeria in particular. I'd be interested to ask you, is there a connection, do you think, between the poverty and the poor governance in the north of the country and the rates of people joining groups like Boko Haram and ISIS? And what does the government do?
I think the fundamental thing is that it is an established fact that poverty provides the enabling environment in terms of social disequilibrium, economically, socially, and otherwise, in making the people vulnerable to recruitment in the first place. But what I think has also fallen short is the government response over the years. And I'm going to break it down to talk about the counter-terrorism strategy of the government. You see, it has to be a whole of a system approach. It has to be a whole of a society approach. When I talk about a whole of a system approach, I'm talking about the arms, I mean, the 3 tiers of government, and then the three arms of government as well: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Now, if you look at the approach that has been deployed in Nigeria over the years, it has been largely executive because the military is under the executive. So you have a situation whereby it is just more of like an executive order in terms of the operational strategies that the government has deployed over the years. Whereas, for instance, who is doing the arrest of Boko Haram fighters? It is the military. That is strange to the constitution. So you have a situation whereby terrorist groups are being arrested and then tried executively, if I could use that word, permit me, without taking them through the judicial process of trial. So you have the Operation Safe Corridor that is now playing the role that the Nigeria Prison Service is supposed to play. You arrest people and then say you are rehabilitating them. That is the constitutional mandate of the prison in the first place. And when I talk about a whole of a society approach, you need multiple building blocks in religious group, at the community level. Those things are not there. So poverty was driving people on the one hand, and then you also have arbitrary arrest of everybody that is found in the crime scene. And then that began to drive people more away from government and driving them into the hand of the terrorist group. This is what allowed this thing to fester over time, particularly in the case of Boko Haram, where people were being arrested anyhow. I mean, the military is never trained to do that. That is a core mandate of the police. And that is the reason why, if you want to, when I talk about a whole of a system approach, the judiciary must be involved. There is the clear mandate for administration of criminal justice in this, so that when people are arrested, they are taken through the criminal justice process. And then the whole of a system approach. The police must be involved. Like in Nigeria, the police has the the constitutional mandate for maintaining internal security. But what you've seen over the years is that it has been a military-centric approach, and it has not worked. So that is what we need to refocus. That is what the government needs to retool. It cannot be by executive order. You have everything consolidated in the Office of the National Security Advisor. That is too limited. It has to, the scope needs to be widened. And then while poverty has contributed significantly on one hand, these other issues that I talk about in terms of the government strategies have also complicated the matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think it really goes beyond a single issue like poverty. I think what you often see, what you always see with groups like ISIS, is that they piggyback on existing conflicts. They piggyback on existing situations where you have weak or non-existing governments, long-standing grievances, where you have ethnic and religious fault lines, and where you have conflicts. Often conflicts already exist, and ISIS comes in, makes them worse, creates even more chaos, and then presents itself as the force of order that will create stability. And that's a formula that they have applied in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan to some extent, in Libya. And unfortunately, of course, Africa is full of places where you have that basic situation. And that's why I always say that part of counterterrorism should also be conflict prevention in terms of preventing these conflicts from coming up in the first place, but then also preventing them from escalating in the way that I described, because that's really how ISIS gains a foothold. It's often not the cause of conflicts, but it jumps on existing conflicts and makes them worse.
And if I could just come in on this as well, I remember what an Algerian journalist said to me once, which was precisely the importance of a holistic response. Yes, we may need, in certain contexts, a military and security response, but certainly that needs to be one that respects international law. But we also need a response in the educational field. We also need a political and a sociological response, and a religious response, and a civil society response, and a response by the media. And I think that is, as has been outlined here, the most sensible approach. I also want to stress something that I heard from many people in Algeria who had survived the 1990s conflict between the state and the armed Islamic group and other jihadist groups. And they stressed to me that it's impossible to tackle terrorism effectively without taking on and challenging the ideology, the fundamentalist ideology that motivates that terrorism and that helps to recruit to that cause. And I know that that's often seen as very politically sensitive, but to me, that was also a very important takeaway from interviews that I did.
That's very interesting. I just wanted to pick up very quickly on a point that Dr. Neumann made. When we talk about either Nigeria or Mali or other countries where you say that ISIS kind of exploits divisions that already exist, I mean, when we're thinking about ISIS, we think of this, I think in the public imagination, you think of the foreign fighters that come and exploit a local conflict. But I mean, in places like Nigeria and other parts of Western Africa and Northern Africa, are these homegrown jihadists essentially? Who are they from the area, or are they coming in to monopolize on that conflict? Could you just explain a little bit more about how ISIS and local groups interact and cooperate?
Well, I can speak maybe about my experience in Somalia, where I did interviews with former Al-Shabaab fighters, and it was quite clear, and I think this is probably true in a lot of other conflicts across the continent, that most of the people who join these groups are basically not fully radicalized in an ideological sense. They do join because they are fighting local battles. They are also being paid once the group holds territory. But of course, it makes a difference. And in all of these groups, there is an element, I cannot put an exact number of it, let's say 10% of them, who do provide a sort of ideological direction to it, and who do provide an ideological framework, and who do take it into certain directions that perhaps the foot soldiers wouldn't necessarily have taken the organization into. And so I think that's where the foreign fighters do make a difference. They do make a difference because they connect what seems to be like a local struggle to something that is much bigger than that, because they provide a narrative and a framework that completely changes what seems like a local conflict into something that has almost global proportions. That's certainly what I saw quite strongly in Somalia when I spent some time there.
Just because we have someone who specializes in Nigeria with us, and obviously it's the most populous state, populous country in Africa. I just wanted to go back to Nigeria quickly. I think kind of what isn't being covered, which is interesting there, is this the animosity between groups like ISIS and Boko Haram. I mean, could you talk to me a little bit about how it's been working in the last few months and years? I mean, you're seeing things now like ISIS taking over territory and land from Boko Haram, and then installing what seems to me to be quite caliphate-y local governance decisions, like taxing religious taxes for the wealthy, which aren't really. We're used to seeing that in places like Iraq and Syria for sure, where they make money that way. Could you talk to me a little bit about how Boko Haram and ISIS have been operating in northern?
By that, I assume you're talking about the ISWAP that just took away
Yes.
the leader of the Boko Haram version out of the way. I think having studied the trajectory of the jihadist movement, particularly the two factions over time, why Boko Haram, the Jahas, presented itself as a more brutal version of the two. I think the more dangerous one is ISWAP. And I'm going to tell you the reason. The reason is because they appeal to the conscience of the people and saying, come, government has failed in providing basic, in living up to the constitutional mandate of security of life and the welfare of the people. So you have a situation whereby ISIS is not just brutal. I mean, ISWAP is not just brutal on the community. ISWAP is presenting itself as an alternative governance actor to the state, and then taxing the local community, saying we are going to provide the basic health services, we are going to provide the basic responsibilities of government. ISWAP is presenting itself in such a way to serve as an alternative governance actor. And by the time they continue to secure the buy-in of the local people, you know that the violence that is going to be unleashed on the nation, on the captured territory, is going to be much more harrowing than what the Boko Haram, with all its letter strategy and everything that we have seen so far. Because this one tends to gain more popularity with the people, and then much more sophisticated because of international alliance as well, and then much more ideologically driven and grounded. So I think why government, if government decide to say, okay, we are dealing with two factions of jihadist group in Nigeria, for instance, now dealing with Boko Haram and then deploying military response strategies to tackle Boko Haram. Much more difficult for government is how it's going to deal with ISWAP, because these want to clearly replace government in the local community. And then when you look at the international fraternity that it has with more sophisticated group, government and the people should fear. And I think that is what we're dealing with in Nigeria now, which is very, very complicated. You have one that is brutal on one hand, and you have another one that is appealing to the local populace, and it's much more sophisticated than the brutal one itself.
That's a good point. If no one else had anything to add on Nigeria, I might ask a more general question about obviously the period when the caliphate was at its height in the Middle East from 2013, 14, 2017, before the SDF and Iraqi forces managed to destroy the caliphate. We saw a large number of either ISIS organized or ISIS inspired attacks in Western cities, which sort of instilled a lot of terror in it, and that guided the response that we had in the Middle East, I think. I don't know who's best to answer this, perhaps Dr. Neumann, but do we think that the threats that these groups are going to pose are going to be much more localized in the future and less global, or do you think that we still, in the West, still do face a threat from these groups?
Well, so far they are much more localized, and I think that's to do with a couple of factors. The first is that in the case of the Syrian-Iraq situation, we had a very large number of Europeans, and I'm speaking about Europe now, actually going there and bringing back, to some extent, the idea of fighting for the so-called caliphate. There was a lot of propaganda in European languages, but also operatives in the case of the Paris attacks in November 2015 and other attacks, Brussels, for example, who'd been training in Syria and then sent back. We don't see that same kind of movement at the moment to conflicts in Africa, and certainly not the same kind of propaganda. I guess it's also because the so-called caliphate in Syria was ideologically speaking, a very important fight. It was something very significant for these people, and a lot of the local conflicts in Africa are not seen in the same way. They don't produce the same excitement. They don't produce the same propaganda. And of course, in many of these conflicts, you do not have the same degree also of Western involvement. I think they are all reasons why perhaps you don't have the same extent of focus on the West right now.
It's an interesting point you make about this refocusing of Western attention. I mean, obviously we've seen Biden in recent months indicating that he wants to be involved less in foreign conflicts, and Afghanistan is a great example of that. do any of the panel think that the US sort of disengagement from conflicts, particularly where Al-Qaeda or jihadists are involved, do you think this sends a message to governments that are potentially tackling their own problems with that essentially America might not be there if it needs any counterterrorism support?
I would say this. I think that we need an international approach that views terrorism anywhere as being equally unacceptable to terrorism in Paris or New York. And I really worry that to some degree, it's only those killing Westerners that are seen as the problem, and ongoing killings in other places, including in Africa, are seen sort of as acceptable. And in fact, you can sort of be in the non-violent extremist category as long as you're only killing at home. And I think 9/11 should have taught us that the security of those in one place may be directly linked to the security of those on the other side of the world. And that's a lesson that we do not want to have to learn again.
If I may quickly add to this, why the recent experience in Afghanistan has thrown up a lot of question and agitation in the mind of the people. I think, Professor Karima said, what is very important is that it's too early for us to draw certain conclusion about what role America is going to play in these unfolding realities in the days to come. But what I think the recent experience of COVID-19 has taught us is the fact that, and I still see that missing gap where even though the heads of nations, G20, G7, Security Council, the United Nations continue to talk about the global terrorism. The same energy with which we talked about COVID-19, the same energy with which we pursue COVID-19 in flattening the curve, I think we also need such level of international response. No matter no matter the faults that we have found in addressing COVID-19, I think it is still the only recent global experience where you have heads of nations, countries, multinational agencies talking about one singular thing. And it might appear that maybe we think terrorism do not have the same, is not capable of policing the same scale of destruction. I think that would be a global deception. So we need to have that framework of thought. We need to think about how we are actually going to muster the same global response in tackling terrorism. Because if you tackle it in bits and pieces and you don't address the whole issue, a threat in Nigeria is going to be a threat to UK one day. A threat in Afghanistan is going to be a threat in China, because the relative peace that we have is that weapons of mass destruction has not gotten into the hand of these people. The day they get sophisticated and get to that level, then we know that we are going to get awakened to new realities. And I think America needs to continue to play that global role with other international alliances. And then one thing that I think we also need to put on the front burner is the fact that we also need to see the nexus between arms trafficking and this global terrorism and the jihadist group operation. It is very, very important, because once they cause their terrorist attack, they use weapons, they use arms. It is important that the international cooperation in tackling terrorism financing, arms trafficking is actually put on the front burner, because if they don't have access to some of these weapons, I think their activities is going to be less. But to the extent to which developed countries continue to manufacture arms and it continues to get into the hands of these people, the world will remain unsafe. Thank you.
Do you think that they're looking at your idea of pushing for a kind of a more global, unified, coordinated response? So far the efforts have been quite piecemeal. If you look at French, European, American efforts, have they achieved much in places like Mozambique and Mali? French forces have been stationed in Mali for almost a decade, and they've struggled to stem the expansion of territory that's been taken by groups like Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups. my question, I guess, is do you think French forces and other foreign forces actually have achieved much in the last decade in sub-Saharan Africa, any part of Africa, really? Can you give me any examples?
Well, my quick response to that is the fact that you are the one that is going to take the principal responsibility in securing your home. To the extent to which African leaders continue to rely on these countries for full military support and not ready to actually take their own bit of it, it's only going to be, the success is only going to be marginal. So you have a situation whereby in Burkina Faso, in Mali, of course, there are also entrenched interests. The reasons why these countries are present in places where they are present, we can also not underscore that, underemphasize that. But what is important is that, for instance, America is not going to come to Nigeria to come and help Nigeria to go to the war front. The only thing that America should do for Nigeria is to equip its military. To also not only do that, pay attention to issues of grievances that are actually driving people into engaging with all these terrorist and jihadist groups, which is very, very important. So those supports in terms of multiple blocks of engagement must be put in place. And then at the same time, the rework in terms of, if we want to talk about security response, the nations concerned must still take the primary responsibility in securing their territory, while these other powerful nations provide them with the necessary intelligence support in building their capacity. That is what is important. But when you look at the countries that you have mentioned in the recent time now, like Mali, it's also embroiled in issues of coup and counter-coup. These are creating enabling environment for this jihadist group to actually fill the vacuum that is being created in the governance and then proliferation of ungoverned spaces. So the extent to which, for instance, France established the G5 security network, and then Mali, that is also at the center of this, is also embroiled in another coup and counter-coup issues. You know that the primary issues are going to be relegated to the background, while politics takes the show out of everything. And that is what we're having now, that is also causing multiple instability in those places. So you, like Peter Neumann said, you have a number of things that these jihadist groups are actually having a field day now, because of the multiple crises that is happening in these places. And to the extent that those continue to be sustained, then issues of counter-terrorism is going to be largely relegated or affected significantly and negatively.
And Professor Bennoune, what do you see as the role of the United Nations in conflicts like this? I mean, obviously, I was based in Lebanon for 6 years, and I know UNIFIL has a huge presence on the Israeli border. You know, people say that their presence there has had a huge calming effect. Other people say it's just a natural shift in conflict between Israel and Lebanon, that there hasn't been anything recently. I mean, what do you think should be and should be the United Nations role in conflicts there?
Well, I think the United Nations has a significant role to play in responding to terrorism. I think some of this role has been fulfilled with the adoption of the UN's global counterterrorism strategy, the emphasis on human rights in that strategy, which is so critically important. I think that we need to see more response from the human rights actors in the UN human rights system. I'm very pleased that now we do have a UN Special Rapporteur on the protection of human rights while countering terrorism, who was able to carry out country visits and to issue reports about those visits, and a number of other special rapporteurs. I can tell you, for example, with the situation in Afghanistan, have been very engaged in these questions. But clearly, with the pandemic, as has been mentioned, the UN itself is also facing a very serious budget crisis, and I think that limits the effectiveness of its response. And that is a challenge that member states have to take up, because the role of the UN, precisely in playing that coordinating function that we have been talking about, is critically important.
And while I have you, ISIS and a lot of these groups, part of their modus operandi, if you like, is to destroy the sort of cultural heritage and preservation of these areas. In part, it works to kind of break these bonds between communities and traditions. What can we do? I mean, obviously, Africa is home to a huge amount of cultural heritage that we need to protect. Are you worried about groups going after things like this?
I did a series of reports on fundamentalism, extremism, and cultural rights for the UN in 2017, one for the Human Rights Council and one for the General Assembly, that addressed many of these issues. And what I found is that there are really common themes across a range of fundamentalist and extremist movements around the world that really have an agenda of what I called cultural engineering, aiming at redesigning culture based on a very monolithic worldview, focusing on what they often call purity, policing culture, policing what they consider to be honor and modesty, claiming cultural superiority, sometimes imposing what they claim is an authentic culture on the population, for whom actually this imposition is experienced as very alien. So very often these groups are actually destroying and seeking to destroy both tangible cultural heritage, such as the mausoleums in northern Mali and the manuscripts, which are so historically important and part of the cultural heritage of humankind, but also attacking cultural practices, very often syncretic practices, which are merging perhaps Islam and local practice of religion and local cultural traditions. And so I think the defense of culture and of local cultures in all their diversities becomes a very important part of resistance to these groups, and mobilizing cultural resistance. And it is very inspiring to see local people rally around that agenda. So for example, in northern Mali, where ordinary people were hiding very important historical manuscripts under the floorboards of their homes to protect them from the jihadist groups, where you had people, and I had the honor of interviewing some of these people who actually went out and protested when the jihadist groups began to destroy some of the very important mausoleums. In fact, I was able to interview one person whose father had been killed in such a demonstration. And so just as culture is a target of jihadist groups, I think it needs to be a focus of response and resistance. And what I argued in my report for the Human Rights Council is that policies that combat discrimination and the right to take part in cultural life, or that promote freedom of artistic expression and the right to education in accordance with international norms, are actually core aspects of combating fundamentalism and extremism. They're a core part of this holistic approach that we've been talking about. And we've seen a wide range of very important civil society initiatives in this regard. And taking one from the African continent, I think of a wonderful cultural center east of Algiers in Algeria, in a part of the country that was affected for many years by the presence of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And there's a small cultural center called Afaq Horizons, which is running a range of programs, everything from a library to cultural programming, which are really some of the only cultural programs available in that area. They even have a very innovative women's beekeeping project. So they're literally trying to create alternatives for people. And I am not saying, of course, that this is an alternative to an effective security response, but it is a very essential complement. And so when governments curtail the space for the civil society, when they silence these voices in the creative and artistic sectors, they are actually undermining those who are a critical part of the response to extremist groups, as well as to the defense of human rights.
I mean, you talked a little bit about Mali, but are there any other good examples you can give us of either a strong civil society reaction to these jihadist groups that could maybe potentially be a model for others?
Thank you for that question, because I think it's such an important question to look at the role of civil society and also to learn from history. And I'll take another example from Algeria, where I in part grew up. And Algeria in the 1990s was afflicted by terrible terrorism against the civilian population by the armed groups. There were also abuses carried out by the authorities as part of the counter-terror response. But one of the critical turning points was the mobilization of civil society and ordinary people against the terrorist groups. And this happened in part because there had been a political opening in Algeria in the late 1980s. And so civil society had been able to begin to organize itself. And as the targeting of intellectuals began by the armed Islamic group, it was the women's movement that first went out and mobilized public protests, which Algeria had not seen very many of for some time then. And then as the killings in the civilian population expanded, ultimately these civil society groups were able to really generate massive protest against terrorism. And this played a critical role in shifting public opinion, so that, for example, when the armed Islamic group called for a boycott of schools in about 1996, the population utterly rejected that. And in fact, mothers would take their children to school and wait for them outside of the school, really in a show of defiance. And we need to learn from that history. I think of groups like Jazairuna, the Algerian Association of Victims of Islamist Terrorism, that have tried to keep alive the memory of those days and the memory of those who have been lost. And again, it's not an alternative to an effective law-abiding security response, but it is a critically important complement.
Thank you very much. I mean, I speak as a journalist, a member of the media, who potentially haven't done a very good job over the last year or two, or during COVID, where everything, as I've talked about in this session, there's been a lot of concentration on COVID in the last year. I mean, do you think that this kind of media blind spot for what's happening in Western Africa and Northern Africa with the resurgence of extremists, do you think that because we don't cover it in the same breathless way that we did with what was happening in the Middle East, do you think that this gives, it sort of takes the pressure off governments a little bit? And what can the media do? To anyone.
Okay, let me talk a bit about the recent experience in Nigeria, and particularly in the northwest part of the country. I think to a large extent, the media cannot be everywhere. And to be able to unearth some of these realities, you need serious engagement in terms of investigative journalism. So to the extent to which those areas also become unreachable, then the suffering of the people, it becomes very difficult to escalate it to international audience or interlocutors. So that is one. The second thing is also the fact that majority of the people who are caught up in these conflict zones where the jihadist group are actually unleashing terror on the people, they are people who I would describe as who blighted by poverty. And then when I talk about poverty in this regard, I'm not only talking about it in economic sense, I'm talking about a 360-degree view of poverty. People who have no access to education, good quality education, so they don't know their right from. They don't know they don't know the rights that they have. They are not enlightened, and then they are primarily engaging or living in the agrarian communities where they are largely cut away from basic media tools that everybody that is living in the city might have access to. So to the extent to which they suffer some of these issues, it becomes difficult to be able to escalate the pains that they go through. So you have a situation whereby 50,000 persons are displaced from a rural community on the boundary of Nigeria and Niger Republic to Niger Republic. And then you don't get to hear about that until maybe 3 or 4 weeks after, where they've been living in very poor condition. So, and it's also very difficult for the media people to be able to access those places. And another thing that is very, very important is that when kinetic operation is going on, then you have a situation whereby telecommunication is cut off. So there is even no means of accessing those people, if at all, if you are able to access them. So you've had such experience in Zamfara State in Nigeria, in Kebbi State, in some part of Sokoto State in the recent time. And to the extent to which it becomes difficult to escalate this pain through the work of the media to national or global audience, the people continue to suffer. It is in few instances where you have opportunity of talking to the people. Maybe you meet them, I mean, maybe in conferences in Abuja, that they begin to open up on their plight that just a few weeks ago, bandits attacked a community in Zamfara State and killed 100 persons, for instance. I feel like, but this thing didn't make it to the media. So it's, in most of the cases, it's not that probably it is a deliberate effort on the part of the media to close a blind eye to those situations. It is just the external environment and realities that condition the media not to be able to cover those in some instances. And secondly, you also have some that are politically sensitive, particularly when you are moving towards the election. Definitely you are not going to, I mean, you have a party structure that you have a regime that is probably not going to allow itself to be painted in blue and black. So because to the extent to which those things make it to the media, then it makes the ineptitude of the government to become apparent to the people. You know, that can sway electoral outcomes. So once you continue to approach the to the election cycle, you will definitely expect a situation whereby a lot of things for political sensitivity are not going to make it into the media. So it's a whole lot of issues that mix to create this reality whereby the pains of the people caught up in conflict is not properly escalated to global and international, I mean, national and global audience.
And what's, sorry, go on, no, go.
Can I just say something perhaps a little bit provocative? I think that the reality is that outside of the sort of human rights, NGO, international community bubble, very few people in Western countries are interested in Africa. And very few people read articles about Africa. Like, very few people are like us on this panel. We read articles in the media about foreign countries just because we want to learn about these foreign countries. But you know, Josie, that if you want to sell a story, you have to make it relevant to the readers. People in Britain read stories about foreign countries because they think it is relevant to them somehow. And in the past, unfortunately, terrorism has been an angle to make it relevant to people. Nowadays, very few people in Western countries believe that terrorism in Burkina Faso affects them in any way. In recent years, unfortunately, another angle has been migration. That's why a lot of countries in Africa got some coverage, because Europeans are afraid of these Africans coming to Europe, right? But if you don't use any of these angles, either migration or terrorism, it's very difficult to get a Western audience to be interested in the situation in Burkina Faso.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Sorry.
Yeah.
But I think there's a responsibility to try anyway. And I think as an educator, we have responsibilities to interest young people and expose young people to these stories, because they may in fact be very interested, but not have the opportunity to come into contact with that information. And one thing I would ask the media to do here is to not treat the victims of mass casualty terrorism on the African continent as the so-called third world body count, just a sort of nameless, faceless statistic, to, as they have done with victims of terrorism in other regions, tell their stories. There's so many stories one could tell. I think about my childhood neighbor in Algeria, Shedli Hamza, who was a consultant for the UN's development program, who was killed in the 2007 bombing by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb of UN headquarters. And he was someone who told me he made the conscious decision to stay in Algeria when he could have been elsewhere as a consumer of development, but he wanted to build opportunities for young people. And he in fact built a school in his spare time that is still running in Algiers. Or I think of the human rights lawyer Shukri Belaid, who was assassinated in neighboring Tunisia, and his wife, who went out the same day he was assassinated and led a protest against killings like that, and has become a critical force for working against violence. These names should be household names. And I think if we tell these stories, there is a greater possibility of interesting the international public. And there's really a moral obligation to tell these stories, like the stories of victims of terrorism anywhere else, so that we remember exactly what is at stake.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we need to make more of an effort to creatively tell not good news stories, but where, you know, civil governance is working, for example, and tell the stories of how to successfully, you know, how a village or how a town might have successfully combated insurgents and insurgency. I mean, it's funny because when I try and think of some very successful public pressure campaigns, the two that come to mind immediately are both the Chibok girls in Nigeria and also Joseph Kony. I mean, those were two that were revolved around issues in Africa, but somehow captured the public imagination. And I guess it's our job as media to try and figure out how to tell these stories while engaging people and not making it feel like it's something that's happening, you know, thousands of miles away.
And I think I would add to that by saying that perhaps it would be even better sort of to cover conflicts before they become like huge conflicts, to cover countries where you see tensions, where you see ethnic and religious fault lines, you know, grievances, weak governance, and so to get the international community engaged in issues before they escalate into a situation where, in fact, only a military response will be the obvious solution, where, you know, to kind of raise attention and create awareness where other instruments of influence may actually have a greater effect than just the military.
And you're right, not waiting until something is a crisis to cover it, because then our understanding starts from the moment of the crisis, and we don't know what precipitated that, and that in turn means that we don't know how to respond to it.
Well, if you have a crisis, then the only sort of solution is a violent or a military solution, right? So ideally, you start before it gets to that point, so that a wider range of instruments is still available and an option.
So I think I want to quickly make, this is very, very fascinating. And then I just want to cite an example about how I think the narrative about what happens in these conflict zones should be portrayed in the media. So I give you an example of an experience I had in Maiduguri. The first time I traveled to Maiduguri, northeastern part of Nigeria, as somebody living in Abuja, working on civil military relations, it's a normal thing that if you tell anybody that you are going to Maiduguri, it's like probably you are committing suicide, and then they feel like, why should you go there? What do you want to go and do there? So the first day I landed in Maiduguri, I was expecting that the street will be deserted. There will be no people on the street by 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. But on 10 p.m., people were still living their normal life and everything. And it created an impression in me that when I go back to Abuja, I started talking to a few media friends that I think it might be good for us to also share the positive narrative that is coming up in these places. People are still going to school. People are still doing their regular social engagement. They are still doing sport. There are pockets of good experiences that are coming out. That is not just about dark experiences, dark news. 20 persons have been bombed, 30 persons have been killed, 50,000 people have been displaced. We empathize with those people. But I think to create a balanced narrative, it's also good to look for pockets of positive experiences, no matter how small they are, to also tell those stories. And I think the media probably has not done enough in that regard because positive news don't really sell. But I think if we do critical introspection, it might be good to also see the ways through which media can engage positive stories that come from these bad or conflict affected zones.
Can I just say how important I think that point is? I wrote a book called Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, which includes stories of Muslims and people of Muslim heritage in many countries, in many regions, working against fundamentalists and extremists. And one thing that I said, and maybe it seems like an anachronistic example now, but what a shame it is that everyone knows who Osama bin Laden was, but how few people know of all of those standing up to the bin Ladens and the would-be bin Ladens in their contexts. And that's something that we absolutely have to change. We need to know the stories of people like Sabine Mahmood, who ran the T2F Cultural Center in Karachi, Pakistan. She was trying to create a civil society space where people could come and debate very difficult issues like the blasphemy laws. And she said to me, you know, what may be obvious to you is not obvious to someone else. You need that time and that space to be able to change people's minds. And she very tragically was actually killed by a young jihadist who had attended some events at her center, but her center has been kept alive by other advocates. And we absolutely need to tell those stories and remember those people. And I remember a wonderful story from Kenya of people refusing to tell terrorists who the Muslims or the Christians were on a particular bus that was targeted by a jihadist group, that all of those people stood together so that no one could be separated and targeted as a non-Muslim. Let's tell those positive stories.
That's a very important point. Thank you so much for making it. But just to conclude, because I know we're running out of time, I'd love to ask each of you from either from your specialisms or just from your own personal interest, which country do you think that we should be concentrating on, or would you like us to see more concentration on? You know, whether it be that we think that this is an emerging threat, or we think this is a positive example of something. I'd love to hear just very quickly from each of you, you know, which country you think deserves more attention, or and how and for what reason.
Well, if no one else is starting, I'd say Mozambique is a conflict that's been escalating steadily for the past 2 years. It's very underreported. That's not entirely the fault of journalists. It's very difficult to get to northern Mozambique and to provide footage from there. But that's certainly a conflict that I see, unfortunately, going on for some time, and potentially even be spreading to neighboring countries. So I would like to see more coverage and more attention to that conflict.
Well, I think for me, the obvious response is the fact that we should be concerned about countries that are quiet but vulnerable now. And in that regard, if what one has read in the recent time shows any cause for worry, I would say you should be concerned about countries like Senegal, who that appears like everything is normal on the real sense of it. You should be concerned about because we are seeing a situation whereby these groups are morphing into all kinds of groups and then penetrating some of these countries by virtue of some level of intelligence report that is available to us. And I think largely we should be concerned about countries that have also been engulfed in this crisis. We should be concerned about countries like Nigeria of over 200 million people, where the Islamic State is bent on creating a foothold. And then you should also be concerned about the countries like Cameroon, where you have multiple crises fueling instability. You have separatist agitation. Then
I think we've frozen a bit there.
And Boko Haram is.
Thank you so much for that. And lastly, Professor Bennoune.
I completely agree about what has been said about Mozambique. I think also the level of the brutality that was shown to the civilian population by the armed groups, beheadings, public beheadings, killing of children in front of their parents even, that has been reported, and also what is at stake in the north of the country in terms of that being a oil producing region, and the fragility of the state in confronting those groups. I hope that Mozambique gets much more attention conversation. But I also would return to what I said earlier about the need to learn from the past. I would encourage people to look at the experience of Algeria in the 1990s, where many difficult lessons were learned. And I think, if we don't learn the lessons of the past, as I said, we're going to be condemned to have to learn them over again. And that is a terrible shame.
Thank you for that ending note. And I want to thank you so much to the panel for such a spirited debate on such an interesting topic. And thank you so much as well to our audience for tuning in. Thank you so much.